Introduction. This is Daniel Reilly. He's an information security manager for a small labor management company in Seattle. He's also an independent security researcher, and he's also been a previous speaker at BSides. So just give a warm welcome for him, and then.
Thank you. All right, excellent. Thank you guys for coming out after lunch. I know everybody's tired, so I'll try to keep it interesting and fun. If you have anything to say, just kind of shout it out. I like being interactive, and I probably won't notice hands, so just call it out. So today we're going to be talking about Mifare, which is a specification for RFID cards. As he said, I'm Daniel Reilly, or you can call me Oni. I think as hackers, we all need to go back to using handles. All right, so who am I? Well, I'm a lot like Archer, and I've given this as my third presentation. My first presentation was a black hat presentation on writing Sciencey software. My second presentation was a gray hat presentation on exploits, and now we're at my white hat presentation where we're talking about defense techniques for RFID. Alright, so why did I choose My Fair Lady as a title for this? Well, My Fair kind of lends itself to the topic. But also the topic of the movie, My Fair Lady, is teaching a Cockney flower girl how to speak and act like a lady and pass herself off. That's very much kind of like what we're doing here with RFID today. So we're going to cover some My Fair background, and then we're going to talk about the landscape and the threat model that I was using, some cool crypto stuff, some more fun RF stuff, and then a conclusion that everybody should walk out on because it's going to be the same stuff shortened again. Thank you. Alright, so before we get started, you guys got to know some terminology. Some of those things look scary, but I promise they're not. So the first one up there, PBKDF2, that's the password-based key derivation function. You take a crappy password, you get back something that's not nearly as crappy, 32 bytes long, based on the password, so it's recoverable. Crypto 1. All you need to know about Crypto 1 is that it's horrible. You hear Crypto 1, you think boo. Alright? AES 128, that's the opposite. That's yay. We love AES. Alright, HMACs. So for people who are not into cryptography, HMAC is a way of authenticating a message using a hash of that message. If the message was changed, the hash would match, you're good to go. Encrypt then MAC is an additional HMAC step that says first you're going to encrypt your data and then you're going to take the MAC of it rather than taking the MAC of the plain text. Don't ever MAC your plain text. Alright, and then the puffs. Those are physically unclonable functions, or as of now we consider them physically unclonable. Those are like biometrics for hardware, your fingerprints and iris analysis, only done on the principles of your hardware as opposed to your biology. Alright, so now getting into the classes of RFID tags, we've all probably been pretty familiar with these now. You've got the system on a chip or the single board computer smart devices, which are basically running a full computer on a credit card sized device. You can run full crypto. You can do all the internet checks you want. They're super great. That's not what we're dealing with today. So secured memory devices were devices that had memory that were locked by some kind of usually proprietary. Now it's more open at cryptography. But back in 95, they used Crypto 1, boo, which was completely closed down and not published. It was broken, and that moves them down to the simple memory device. These are memory devices where all of the sectors inside of it can basically be read by anybody with a reader. There's no security involved. And then down from that, you have your simple broadcast devices. These are like your RF tags that can only transmit a single ID. We're slightly better than that still because we've got memory we can use. Alright, so this is a very brief timeline of how I've kind of picked apart the Mifare spec. So in 1994 they introduced the spec with the Crypto 1 cryptography, and within 2 years it was picked up by Seoul, South Korea as their main transportation card for carrying fares. So then there's this huge gap where apparently nobody was doing anything to secure it, because then in 2006, the first Black Hat talk was released, which did a partial algebraic analysis of Crypto 1 and reduced the key space. So now it became very much more crackable. Then in 2008, just a short 2 years later, there were two talks that were released on simultaneous but separate research. The first researcher, the Black Hat Talk 1, he did another further partial decryption or a partial deconstruction of the encryption algorithm. And then the second talk, he actually fully broke the crypto. He laid out the key space, all of the nonces. It was just broken, not usable. All right. They don't change anything. 2008, they released a mobile industry group, and they say, hey, instead of fixing cryptography, let's get you to use your cell phones to do it. Awesome. So then they also announced that they're starting to incorporate AES, but it's not by default, and it's not going to replace the old crypto system, which is still in use today. All right, so then moving forward from that, another Black Hat Talk is released. More of the system is broken, only this one has hacks in the wild that are being used in South Korea to refill people's transportation cards. It deals with an Android app you can get if you ever go to South Korea. I think you can still use it. All right, and then in 2014, they still haven't repaired their crypto because now they support AES, so they feel good. And they say, hey, we're going to release the SDK because now everybody can program bad stuff. And then the final Black Hat Talk in 2014, the gentleman just came out and said, don't use Mifare. It's broken. It's not secure. Don't use it. I have to disagree with him on that. We'll get to that in a minute. So then in 2016, they released Mifare Plus, the Evo 1, which by default can support AES in a security mode called Security Mode 3. However, you can still choose Security Mode 1, which is the Crypto 1 standard and is still very broken. Alright, so going into where I was working. So I work at a warehouse labor management company, and a lot of what we deal with is the warehouse data. So we have personnel and shift data down there in the lower left corner. That's the guy trying to get out the warehouse. He just wants to hit his time clock and run. You've got the freight movement. Those are all the people with the little hand scanners that scan a box and put a box on a truck. All of that stuff goes to an internal network inside of the warehouse. That network is not considered stable. It's considered semi-stable. Then we've got a link to the warehouse data subnet, which is usually a cloud service provider these days where they're storing all of their data. So that link between the warehouse and the data subnet is considered stable. We should always be able to get data from the warehouse subnet to the warehouse, although all of the devices on the warehouse network may not operate all at once and update with the information. So then we tap into their data stream between their corporate offices. We apply some super cool analytics stuff to it, and we spit back out more information up to their warehouse corporate offices. So this is kind of the landscape that we're looking at using RFID in. And right off the bat, you see freight movement and personnel shift data are really easy to capture if you can use a secure RFID. However, you don't want your personnel walking around with a card that's leaking data about who they are or about what your business is. So these are the threats that I didn't consider first off. And if you don't like them, if they're not applicable to your area, that's fine. Go ahead and figure out some solutions for these. But can't approve everything all the time, and aiders are going to aid. So what I didn't deal with is offline readers, but I did kind of sort of deal with it because my boss made me. I told him, hey, we're just not going to deal with readers going offline. He goes, yeah, we work in warehouses, and that's going to happen a lot. We need to deal with it. So I got overruled. Unattended physical access to readers. If some guy can get into your warehouse, open up your time clock with a crowbar and attach something to it, you already lost. I can't help you. All right, preventing tag modification. This is a big one. A lot of people ask, can you stop somebody from changing one of these RFID tags? No, you cannot. You can simply detect if it's been done. Now, with a single board computer or one of the smarter devices, you might be able to do that. But with one of these Mifare devices, good luck, have fun. All right, so since I tell you what I didn't want to work on, let me tell you what I actually did work on. So that is data modification. If the data is modified, can we detect it? Data leakage. If somebody's walking around with a personnel RFID card, is somebody going to get their social security number or their place of business? Card-based attacks against the reader were the absolute most fun to research. And they were surprising about how many I found. And then network sniffing and man-in-the-middle attacks, these should just not work. Who here has ever set up a virtual LAN network so that you can segregate parts of your network? Every single person should have their hand up. So go home and separate your network out in VLANs. And then your network, you won't be able to see the request going back to the database from your RFID card reader. Alright, and then the last one, card cloning. This is a huge problem because even in the world of Mifare, the cards, the first sector of the card is locked. You're not supposed to be able to overwrite it. That's the unique identifier from the manufacturer. However, there are Chinese magic cards which allow you to overwrite all those sectors, including the first sector, the 0 block, which will allow any card to completely and fully emulate any other Mifare card. So we need to be able to stop that. Alright, so now let's get into why I wrote up my own system as opposed to just using the hundreds that are out there. Sorry about that. This is why we can't have nice things. That was perfectly timed. Alright, so I'm going to kind of work these backwards. Sniffing the network traffic, it should never be able to happen. Your readers should not be on the same network as the rest of your computers, let alone the guest network, where I can just sit in your lobby and log in and watch all of your people. Alright, unencrypted remote DB queries. This is what I'm talking about. If you have an encrypted card, poor implementations will decrypt the information and then search the database for that person to see if the card is valid. So if you have an encrypted card, I don't have to decrypt it. I just have to watch your network traffic to see what it comes out as. Now I have a chosen ciphertext attack, basically. HTTP APIs. People, Let's Encrypt works. It's awesome. Don't use HTTP anymore. Alright, let's get into the malicious data modification and data leakage. So, data stored in plain text on a Mifare card generally is relying on the Crypto 1 standard for protection. So there is no protection. And that is, we've known that since 2008, and Mifare cards are still widely distributed. In fact, the reason I chose to do this talk was because I bought some cards for prototyping without understanding exactly what it was in the package. It was a big giant package of RFID equipment. And I got a bunch of Mifare Classic cards that did not support the EV1 standard yet. They're very old. So I can't just accept Crypto 1. It's broken, it doesn't work. Another problem is that you'll put sensitive data such as an account balance or a user ID token on one of these cards. And then your reader is offline. Let's say you're driving a bus through South Korea. Your network reader doesn't have network connection. It has to trust that the value on the card is correct until it can check it. So if it's being stored without some kind of MAC, some kind of authentication code, anybody could make it anything they want and you have to trust it. That's not good. And like that last note says, that's all basically accepted to deal with the offline readers. So when I told my boss I don't want to deal with that, and he said no, we had to come up with a better plan. Alright, card-based attacks on readers. This was fun. So you've got all of your typical attacks that you would expect, only now instead of typing from a keyboard or dropping a session across a VNC server, you have to write your command to a card and then swipe the card on the reader. But then you get fun stuff like SQL injection, where people are still dropping account IDs just as strings. That's awesome. I love that stuff. JavaScript injection. Even if the reader works, the website that they present you once you log in doesn't work. It has all of the same flaws of every other web app. Buffer overflows, I didn't get into the bottom of the libraries. There's libfreefare and there's libnfc. I would be willing to bet money that those have buffer overflows in them, and just nobody's looking at them yet. Alright, and this was the most fun of any of the ones I found. One second. Alright, so I was working on finding reader software, and through one of our connections, they actually got me set up to do a test on a reader set. And so this is a very condensed down version because I wasn't allowed to show the actual test. It was going to be very embarrassing for people that we don't really want to embarrass. So this is a very condensed down version. I got the card and I logged in just like a normal user would, and it says welcome to work, blah. I'm like, okay. So I wrote a utility after about 3 hours called tag to string. It took me about 3 hours to figure out that this was just a string with ASCII string on it. So I can dump the string and it gives me back, oh hey, the same thing it spit out on the command line. Well, that's not good. Let's see if I have control of that. So what I did was I rewrote the card using another utility I put together, write to tag. And I'm going to put Testerton on there. Oh, what was weird about this reader is instead of blanking the card out with zeros, I had to blank the card out with space characters. So ASCII 32. That was actually what clued me in that it was using an ASCII based system. So I run the reader, I run the card, and hey, it tells me welcome to work Testerton. So now I know I have control of at least part of the display. This part also took several hours because I forgot how command injection works, and so I was running around like a noob. You guys get saved that, and I just went straight to the commands on this. But the first thing you're always going to do is just write a sample string to see if your commands are even going to work. This is what I forgot. Yeah, there you are. Semicolons, they'll kill you. Alright, and I'm just going to dump the environment variables to see what's on the system. And again, this is being done on a test system, so I already know what's on there, but this is actually the method that I used when I dumped the real system because I wanted to see what was in the environment. We're going to dump it again just to verify that the write worked. Alright, we got our command on the card. Now I walk across the warehouse, swipe the card on the reader. And there we go, we've dumped the environment variable. So seeing the environment's cool. But once we know that we have command injection, we're going to do something much more fun, like probably dump passwords or set up a user, depending on what level we're running at. And we're also going to blame somebody else. You don't want to use your name. And now when I did this in the live environment, I dumped out the Etsy. And that I think was probably what my boss didn't want me to show everybody was the password hash dump. So I went and redid it and I put a different card on there, or a different file that will be more acceptable. Verify the dump again. Alright, let's walk over and swipe our card. Game over. We have control of the reader. So it takes longer because you don't get to just sit down and type in commands. You have to physically walk over and interact with the reader hardware. But beyond that one difference, command injection works pretty much the same with an RFID reader as it does with any other system. Alright. So now that we've talked about all the stuff that was broken, how are we going to fix it? So, any dual core fans here? Yeah, alright. So, rule number 6 is encrypt all the things. You take your bytes off the record. To do that, we're going to use a bunch of different keys, because one key doesn't really work anymore. One key is breakable. So, this gets back to that password-based key derivation function. On the left here, we've got Mr. User. Mr. User gives us the awesome password, I like football, exclamation point. And you can see by the shape of that, it's a little bit jagged, but it's still pretty predictable and uniform. The host OS, the system that Mr. User is running, gives us a 256 pseudo-random salt. That's 32 bytes. And that salt gets saved into the master account storage base encoded. The password's not saved anywhere ever. Alright, both those two pieces get fed into the password-based key derivation function. Now what's really cool is that n parameter is how many times it's going to be cycled through. And the point of the password-based key derivation function isn't to keep your key from getting cracked. It's to make it take a lot longer for an attacker to brute force. So you set that n parameter as high as you can make it on your software so that somebody trying to brute force, I like football, has to get the salt, guess the password, and run it through n numbers of this encryption algorithm. So if you set n to something like 400,000, that means for every guess, they have to run 400,000 derivations of this function. Alright, and that generates a master key. Now, for those of you from the Kerberos world, you might know this or call this a key generating key, because it doesn't actually grant anything. It's simply used for for generating keys, which will be used for granting. Alright, let's look at that. So this is the data keys and the tag update function. So for each tag, you're going to generate a new key, and that key has also its own 32 byte or 256 pseudo-random salt that also gets stored off with the tag, but that salt is stored encrypted, and it's encrypted with the master key. So then that goes through a whole second round of the password-based key derivation function down in the left corner. You can set a different n or just use the same n, but what that will spit out for you is actually the data encryption key. You take the data encryption key, you take the tag data that you want to encrypt, and you'll put that through the AES encryption. That will spit out your tag block that gets written to the tag. Everybody follow? No questions? Awesome. So let's look at the memory layout now. This is shortened. That's what the 3 ellipses dots there mean. So we're looking, this is a typical memory layout. So your lower memory address is at the bottom on the right, and it works its way up. The blue at block 0 there, that is the reserved manufacturer, so we can't use that. Also, the yellow blocks are reserved for the access control keys. So each of these blocks has 2 small cryptographic keys associated with it. That's how the Crypto 1 protocol worked. Those keys are stored at the end of each block all the way up. So there are ways you can use it, but ultimately you can brick your cards that way, so I chose not to use them, and I just count them as dead space. Alright, and then the 2 purple sets of blocks up top are going to hold a hash when we're done, and that's going to be the HMAC 32-byte SHA-256 hash. Alright, so if you look on the right-hand side, I kind of worked out the math for how much space you can actually fit once you take away all the crap that they take from you. So 64 blocks minus 16 trailers minus 1 manufacturer and 2 blocks for the hash gives you 45 blocks. 16 bytes per block, that's 720 usable bytes. Alright, so now that we know how much information we can fit, let's see what we can do to protect it. So, in writing this, I looked for a library for Mifare that supported AES encryption, and I didn't find it. So what I did find was one for the Raspberry Pi that supported the hardware that I was using, the RC522, but it didn't support encryption. So I took the library and I added an RF crypto cipher suite to it, so that way that will handle all of your AES 128. And then I just appended an S to it. And at first I was going to say S is for secure, but that's retarded because then people will go break it. So F is just for safer. It's safer to use one that supports encryption than one that doesn't, right? That's a valid claim. Alright, and then they were using a util.load, which is their write function to the card. And so I just, rather than making a whole set of encrypted load functions, I just piggyback theirs and say if you throw encrypted and true in there, it will do it. So, and then util.dump decrypted, they didn't even have an actual card dump thing on there to get back the memory. it would just print it out to the command line. So I added a dump decrypted, which will return the memory as an object for you to play with. That's up on my GitHub now. You can pull the PRC522 library, and it will have all of the RF crypto stuff in there. Alright, so let's see this crypto demo. Why do I always suggest doing demos? Nope, not you. You're not going to work. Alright, so this is the third of the utilities that I wrote, which is a tag dump, and it just does a memory dump, but it cleans it up nice and pretty. Lowest address is on the bottom, so it matches the memory map that I showed you before. We'll dump it to a string, show that there's nothing on there right now, just so you know I'm not trying to pull an illusion on you. Alright, so I did release a crypto example, but it just kind of took an object and encrypted and decrypted it. So then for you guys, I wrote the better crypto example, which has got all these options. We can now load it from a file, we can do a raw string, and password based. So I'm just going to do a string from the command line here. Hello, BSides. Now I'm entering the password. You should always use get pass. And this part takes a minute because it's actually doing the encryption at this point. And there we go, we got the new bytes. Now I'm going to remove the tag, press enter, rescan the tag. Re-enter the password because the password's not saved anywhere. And there we go. We've got it recovered. Hello BSides, so we know we can do a successful decryption. Let's see what it looks like on the card. We're going to go use the tag dump again. Alright, and you see we've got the blocks written down there. The card's no longer empty. Alright, so now we're going to do, after I fat finger type this, we're going to do a second example, and I'll tell you why in a minute, but bear with me. We're going to show off another way. So we're going to dump, this is a wholly separate tag at this point. Dump it, it's empty. We're going to go through the same process of writing the encrypted data. And I promise this isn't just the same thing again. There's a reason why I'm showing you two. Enter a password, enter the string. Now I'm doing it from the command line, but this is just another option in the program that I had wrote. The point is that the string I'm using is considerably longer than the previous Hello BSides. Alright, the Rebel base is in fact in the North Mountain. Now, as this goes through, and it's doing the AES encryption, it's still got to use the Crypto 1 encryption to speak back and forth to the card. So this is actually, that's why this takes so much longer than you would expect. And then it writes it out to the card. We're going to recover it, make sure our encryption works. Alright. There you go, we've got it decrypted. So excellent. Now the reason I made you watch 2 of those instead of just 1, did anybody notice the longer string? So the longer string of the 2 is going to create a much longer text. So a couple improvements so that we can make our encryption scheme better. What I did there didn't include the HMAC, so there was no hash at the end of the data. We can add that. We can use the CBC mode HMAC, or you can use in OpenSSL they have GCM, which is the Galois counter mode, and there are a couple other ones out there, but we support authenticated encryption modes now, so we should be out using them. Yeah, and then never ever compute the MAC on the plain text. That leaks information about the plain text. You always encrypt it, and then you create the HMAC off of the encrypted data. Alright, so we talked a little bit earlier about using the encrypted tags and then decrypting them and searching the database. That's just silly. So let's talk about using encrypted searches on encrypted databases. And you've got Mr. User down there. He wants to search for Love Windows Updates. He wants to search for a new Windows update called ABC. No. So he's going to type in his search ABC, which is then encrypted with the database password. The database uses the encrypted value to search its encrypted keys and sends back an encrypted result, which gets decrypted and given to Mr. User. So that's all super well and good. It involves a whole nother key that we're going to use called the database key. And this is basically becoming what our update flowchart looks like. I am addicted to flowcharts. I love them. I think they stop errors. So if you look, you can basically ignore the top block with all the variables. They're just basically laying out the sizes of things like the tag ID, the hash value, the data block. So what it's going to do is it's going to take the tag reference, which the tag reference is the tag ID and a secret hash. And it creates this from the database, and it goes and it searches for this encrypted value. So if you're watching on the wire, you don't get to see the tag ID. You only get to see an encrypted search value. On the database side, since you know it's fairly common to search by tag UID, you create another field in your database which has the encrypted tag UID as an indexed field for search. You no longer have to send your plain text tag information across. Alright, so we'll check first just to see if that initial check works, and if it can find that, it looks up the 2 keys that are associated with the tag. That's the tag key and the hash key that's used for generating the HMAC. If it can pull both of those back, it will continue down the left-hand side, and if it fails at either of those checks, you can brick the tag. So you can just overwrite the memory so that none of the sectors are readable again. I've heard that there are ways to undo that, but I have not actually seen it work. Supposing it works, you're going to decrypt the tag. You're going to do the update on the tag. You're going to re-encrypt and hash the tag. You're going to store that information off, and then you're going to write the encrypted data back to the tag. So that's how you would handle an encrypted tag search, update, and then it just cycles all back through next time you read the card. So in addition to that, and our first crypto demo, we know we still have a problem. And the problem is that AES actually leaks information about the plain text size. So if you look up here, you can figure out the cipher length is the plain text length plus a block minus the plain text length mod a block. So since we're talking about AES, that's 16 bytes. And we're assuming a simple ASCII encoding in this case. So you could figure out if your text is 9, your plain text length is 9 characters, your block size is 16, you're going to end up with a 16-byte cipher, right? And then you append a 16-byte IV, which was what the initialization was done with. And that gives you a total size of 32 bytes. Alright, nobody actually looks at encoded bytes. We base 64 encode them so that we can write them out as strings. So base 64 can actually be size predicted using that big block of text there. It's the same basic idea. You've set the size, and then you mod 3 based off of the number of bytes that are used in base 64 encoding. But if we take a cipher text of 495 bytes plus that 16-byte block, you're going to end up with a cipher text of about 512 bytes. And then you can see down there, the lowest one, if you got a 684-byte ciphertext and you get your 32-byte hash, you get 716 bytes out of our 720 usable bytes, leaving us the 4 bytes left over. So we won't overrun our card so long as we never overrun a 684-byte ciphertext. Alright, so this is what I talk about when I say that AES leaks information. Who can tell me which one of those two was the encryption of the longer string earlier? The one with the more data in it. Yeah. Alright. So what we're going to do to stop that is we're going to add a mutation to the end of the card. And no matter what happens, we're always going to make sure the card is 720 bytes long, whether we encrypted 1 character or the maximum of 511, I think I said it at. And the way we're going to set that is we're going to figure out our maximum size, 720, take out the data length that we already have, set that to our mutation length, generate some random bytes, append that with the tag, and then write that all out to the tag. So we're guaranteed to use every byte every time. Don't judge me, food. Alright, so we're going to revisit that last example. I'm going to show you what it looks like with mutation. And again with that. Alright, so we're going to dump a tag again. It's an empty tag. And now we're going to run through 2 different size cryptos. Hello again. I cannot tell you how hard it is to try to think of a string to encrypt for a demo for a room full of people. Alright, we're going to do the tag dump, but you should be able to see right away that there's a difference in the way the tag dump performs. That usually works. There we go. So now we have a short string and a whole lot of data going out. Make sure that we can recover it even with the mutex on there. And I'm abusing the word mutex. It's probably more of just a mutation, but I consider it a mutation that locks the card. Therefore, I'm abusing it. Alright, so we were able to recover the object even though we added all that garbage data to it. Now I'm going to do the longer one, which is from a file. And this is a quote from Helen Keller. Security is mostly a superstition. It does not exist in nature, nor do the children of men as a whole experience it. Avoiding danger is no safer in the long run. And I went too fast. Alright, so we're going to now put that text from the file onto the card, and we're going to use the M option, which is what actually is telling the crypto example to add the mutation to the text. I'm going to write this. There we go. We see we're writing out all the same bytes again. Well, all the same number of bytes. And then we're going to recover the object again. Alright, and we see that we've got it back. And now we're going to dump the tag to make sure that we used all the bytes. No, or we're not. That's cool too. Alright, oh yeah, that's why. So there we go. That's the dump of the two tags together. Now can anyone tell me which one had the longer string of text in it? No, there's no way. Well, I mean, I guess if you were really good at math. Alright, so now that we've covered the encryption side of things, you can keep your data safe. You can know if somebody's modified your data. You still can't tell if somebody's lying to you about the card itself, whether the card is the card it claims to be. So this was actually the most trying and longest part of this research, because RF was not my specialty, but I've learned a lot. So the thing about how the way that RFID works is it uses induction. So power from the reader goes to the card. The card then uses some of that power in its internal processes, and then spits back some power as a communication channel. And though the inductive link is the smaller internal circle, and the communication waves are the generally larger one, the card in the example there is using 2 inductive links, but the Mifare cards actually only use 1. The chips are hardwired to the antenna in the card. Alright, so looking at the RF spectrum, we are in the 13.56 megahertz range. That's that green star. That puts us right there in the RF range, right about the 10.75 meters range. Alright, and so you can see it's actually a fairly low energy standard, as opposed to like the only lower ones are the 125 and 135 kilohertz, and those are basically just the ID tags, the really dumb devices. Alright, so there is a paper that inspired a lot of this talk. That's called Reading RFID Harmonics and Carrier Frequencies. And this is the lab model that they use to try and identify RFID cards. You can see up there that's an oscilloscope. You've got an RFID reader. That oscilloscope is actually a vector network analyzer, which is a relatively expensive piece of equipment. It's got 2 coils which go around the sensor coil, which is in fact the reader, the RFID coil reader. And then you've got your electrical schematic down there. You can see the reader coil is positioned precisely between the 2 sensing coils. That must be awesome to have a lab. What I get to work with, I get to work with a Hack RF1. It's not quite a vector network analyzer, but it will do. So we can get 16 or 32-bit quadrature sampling out of that. Quadrature sampling is simply the combination of a complex number. It gives you the real part, then it gives you the imaginary part, and it just keeps flip-flopping back and forth. So you take any 2 readings of an R and an I, and you get back a complex number. So what we're actually measuring is the power at the carrier frequency, which is 13.56 megahertz, but they actually go down and operate at about 12.56 megahertz, so that when multiple cards are present, they won't overrun and go outside of the ISM band. So we check 13.56, but we also have to measure 12.56. We have 2 carrier harmonics. And then each of those carriers has a 3rd harmonic, which is from music theory. Essentially, it's a wave that is added to our carrier wave at some power with relation to how far away it is from your carrier wave. All you really need to know from that is that for 13.56, the third harmonic is at 40.68, and 37.68 is for 12.56. That means we have 4 spots that we have to measure to get this power analysis from. Luckily in HackRF you can do that in software, but it starts to get really laggy. So I recommended using 2 radios, and I actually picked up an RTL SDR as my second radio. Now, the HackRF can sample at about 20 million samples per second, or 20 megahertz, and the RTL SDR can only do about 2 million megahertz. So the RTL SDR is actually the one that's being used to sample the carrier harmonics, the 13.56 and 12.56, because it's the only set that would fit within the 2 megahertz sample band. Whereas, 37 to 40 wouldn't. So the 37.68 and the 40.68 are being measured by the HackRF1. That's good because they actually have fainter traces of power signals. Alright, so there's my super sciencey setup. I don't get a lab, I get a metal box. You can kind of see the second antenna coming out here. That's the RTL SDR. This blue here, that's the RC522 reader. That's what's actually interacting with the cards. And then you see my HackRF on top of the box. And on the left-hand side, the computer is running a GNU radio program, which is doing a scope plot of the cards. Currently, there's no card on there, so I'm taking a noise reading. Alright, so around 13, this is a power spectral density plot of 2 separate cards being read. And the 0 here, the center frequency, is right about 13 megahertz. So the 0 spike that you see there, that's fairly typical. That's a DC offset error. The other spikes that you see are where 2 tags had highly correlated signals, and where you see them separating apart, that's where 2 tags were not similar in terms of power spectrum. And if you look, you're about 12.56 is going to be, well, this here is about 12.5, so 12.56 is going to be here, and you can see there's a pretty big difference up there. And then 13.56 is going to be about here, and there's not so much difference in that one. So we probably want to focus more on the harmonics in 12 than in 13. Alright, so for everybody who's not super familiar with quadrature sampling or what IQ data is, it's actually just data on the polar plane. So you've got your phase of your signal is spinning around, and then your magnitude of your signal is how far out towards the circle it is from the center. So you're given a real value, which is this line here, and then you're given an imaginary value, which is the Q. I know it's confusing because I for real and Q for imaginary, but there are reasons. You take those 2 measures and you apply a little bit of basic geometry to figure out the hypotenuse of your triangle, and that gives you your magnitude of your signal at that point. So what we're talking about is actually how much power is being reflected back by the card towards the reader during an interaction. And this is a very basic principle here. You have your generator of your signal, you have your Z0, which has some resistance, some capacitance or impedance, and then you have your load. Now, you have a positive wave coming this way, going towards your load, but because of impedance mismatching, you're going to have some wave coming back. And those 2 waves add together to give you what your output carrier signal actually is. So there's math up there. If you love math, have at it. It can all be simplified down into just a single circuit as opposed to the capacitance circuits that are over there. And so what we're trying to get at is, for the tag, what is the unloaded reflection coefficient? And what I mean by unloaded is we can't ever interact with the RFID tag by itself. We have to have a reader stimulating the card to get the card to interact. So we can't ever take a reading of just the card. We have to take a reading of the card and the reader. So what we do to compensate for that is we take a reading of just the reader. That we can do because the reader is its own power source. We then adjust our reading down to the imaginary center line, which is essentially saying no power is being reflected back. This is a perfectly efficient system. We then use and save our modification, and we read all our tag readings. Now they take their tag readings and they fit them to a circle, and then they apply the same shift that they apply without the cards. They apply it to the tag data, and then they measure the clustering density. So you're looking like a k-means clustering. So when I go to do this, we go to put it on a Smith chart, and we read it out. Orange samples are tag 2, blue samples are tag 1. The squares up at the top are the coefficients that are being predicted. And as you can see, there's actually a fairly large gap there. So if you had only 2 tags in your system, you could fairly easily tell which tag produced which of those power spectral signals. So it sounds all good. It sounds like we've got a workable plan. There's a problem. Actually, there are a few problems. So, like I was talking about, the tag readers themselves are part of the power signature that you get. So you have to remove that. In the paper, they held the cards at exactly 1.75 centimeters above the reader. They held it perfectly parallel, and they were able to get exacting readings. Unfortunately, in the real world, people don't hold their hand exactly still. They move the card up and down. So we have to take more realistic readings, and we have to figure out how to compensate for the changing in quality factor. So, and like I said, if you have 2 tags in your tag set, it's fairly easy to predict which one made the power signature. If you have several thousand or more tags, it's going to be very hard because they become very overlapping. There's not as much definition. And the hardware is still expensive, so not everybody's going to want to buy an RFID reader, which also has an RFID analysis tool attached to it, like a Hack RF1, which is still about $300. So the overhead for doing the cryptography is still pretty bad, or the overhead for doing the predictive analytics on the tag data, you probably have to shuffle that off to a cloud server. You don't want to do it on the reader itself. And that comes back to having stable readers. So, and then the signatures are based on the reader that takes the signature. So you will have to have a different adjustment quotient for each of your readers to be able to predict on the same card, because the reader affects the readings. Alright, and then in conclusion, we're going to use the PyRC522 safe to add AES encryption. We're going to encrypt all our databases and queries so that they're not leaky. We're going to isolate our readers off of our regular networks. Scikit and RF and Pandas are what I was using to create the plots and do all of the math stuff. Really fun. And then we're going to use purpose-built RFIDs. If you cannot allow clones in your environment, there are already built RFID systems with electronics added to add signature physically unclonable functions that you can use. Alright, and with that, these are my references. There are too many for me to list on a slide, so if you go to my blog, go to resources for RFID talk, they'll be all there.